The attack on Pearl Harbor is one of the most remembered engagements within the Pacific Theater during the Second World War, and as a result is the center of significant controversies, and today we're going to look at the Japanese perspective on whether the attack on Pearl Harbor was a decisive masterpiece or a strategic and tactical blunder. There are a multitude of accounts for the attack on Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective, but there are very few that can give us the full picture of strategy and tactics the Japanese were employing, and as a result, there is one specific account I'm going to focus on for this video to answer this question. On the 1st of November 1939, Shigeru Fukudome was promoted to Rear Admiral and given command of the fleet flagship Nagato. Shortly after, he would act as duty of Chief of Staff of the combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. In April of 1941, he was transferred to duty as Chief of the First Bureau of the Naval General Staff, which gave him control of operations within the Imperial Japanese Navy, so this means that besides Admiral Yamamoto, Fukudome was the only other person who knew each phase of the Pearl Harbor attack from its very conception. Admiral Yamamoto began entertaining the idea of attacking Pearl Harbor in the closing months of 1940, and this was the first time he openly entertained the idea with Fukudome. He also sought the assistance of a naval aviator who would end up being Rear Admiral Takajiro Onishi, whom he would entrust with planning the aerial attack of Pearl Harbor, since Yamamoto himself had no experience in aircraft and he was limited to an administrative role when it came to Japanese aviation. The reason Yamamoto and Fukudome selected Onishi is because he was a new arrival to the Naval General Staff, and this meant that he was not fully dedicated to conventional operational doctrine within the Japanese Navy, specifically the quick in and out attacks that the Japanese doctrine called for, and of course the well-known decisive battle doctrine. From the very start, Yamamoto wanted the Pearl Harbor attack to fulfill neither one of those major operational doctrines. The Pearl Harbor attack would be a quick in and out operation, and then the force that attacked Pearl Harbor would be redirected to other key points in the South Pacific. What Yamamoto had to keep in mind about the operation from its very start is that he could not focus the United States Navy all day long. The main goal was to quickly disable the United States so the Japanese could expand its empire to the south and collect much-needed natural resources that Japan itself could not produce. At the end of April 1941, Onishi presented the plan to Fukudome within his office at the Naval General Staff, and he stated, "This operation involves two difficult problems. One of them is the technical difficulty of launching aerial torpedo attacks in Pearl Harbor, which is so shallow that aerial torpedoes launched by ordinary methods would strike the bottom. The other concerns the tactical problem, whether a surprise attack can be made successfully. This operation apparently cannot be carried out without a surprise element." Even though he pointed out these problems, Onishi believed the Pearl Harbor operation could be carried out with a 60% chance of succeeding. Meanwhile, Fukudome rated it closer to 40%. These two opinions would then come to clash within the Naval General Staff. Onishi recommended to Yamamoto that the Pearl Harbor operation be carried out, while Fukudome recommended that the operation be dropped altogether as too risky. Over the upcoming months, Yamamoto would make the Pearl Harbor operation a fleet operational study until the 6th of September 1941, when Japan decided it would go to war with the United States if absolutely necessary, which then meant preparations to attack Pearl Harbor were now placed as a full priority. As a result, the Naval General Staff and Combined Fleet Headquarters had to start holding general discussions about the operation, which began in mid-September 1941. Going into the discussions, the Naval General Staff had 5 major problems with the Pearl Harbor operation, which resulted in them being opposed to it. The first one was that the success of the operation relied greatly on the element of surprise. If surprise was not held, the United States would be ready for the Japanese force, and much of the Japanese Navy could be at risk of being lost or damaged, which is something the Japanese could not sustain. It was also argued that in order to help with the element of surprise, the quickest path should be taken which meant the chance of running into other vessels from different nations increased, and thus the element of surprise would most likely be lost if one of those vessels let the United States know that a large formation of Japanese ships was moving eastward. It was also impossible for the Japanese fleet to make it across the Pacific without stopping to refuel, and in the case of the destroyers, they would have to stop and refuel those twice, which further increased the chance of the vessels being caught at a vulnerable moment. 2. The Pearl Harbor attack was not indispensable when placed up against standard Japanese operational doctrine. The Naval General Staff believed that the United States coming across the Pacific Ocean would give the Japanese time to concentrate their navy in specific points for their selection of engagement, which meant they could carry out their in-and-out attacks and even a decisive battle. 3. After sailing across the ocean, it would be difficult for the Japanese to determine whether the United States fleet's key vessels would be present within Pearl Harbor at the scheduled time of attack. 4. It was known to the Japanese that as hostilities neared between themselves and the United States began concentrating more air patrols around the Hawaiian Islands in order to spot any threats before they were within reach of Pearl Harbor, thus giving the United States Navy a chance to evacuate the harbor and repair its battle line. The Japanese aircraft carriers would have to close within 200 miles of Pearl Harbor before launching their attacks. Meanwhile, the United States patrols were extending as far as 600 miles from Pearl Harbor. Finally, the point the Japanese feared the most is that an attack would break down all negotiations between Japan and the United States, and this meant war was the only path they could take, which was way too risky in the long run. As a result of these concerns, the Naval General Staff rejected any attacks on Pearl Harbor. As a result of this rejection, Yamamoto would elaborate upon specific points of the plan and had Rear Admiral Yugaki, his chief of staff, submit the plan to the Naval General Staff, and it read as follows. The present situation, i.e. that of the United States fleet in the Hawaiian Islands, is, strategically speaking, tantamount to a dagger pointed at our throat. Should war be declared under these circumstances, the length and breadth of our southern operation would immediately be exposed to a serious threat on its flank. In short, the Hawaii operation is absolutely indispensable for successful accomplishment of the southern operation. Moreover, when we consider the naval strength ratio between the United States and Japan, we see that we would have no chance of victory unless a decisive attack was launched at the earliest possible opportunity. Therefore, the Hawaii operation is truly indispensable to the accomplishment of the mission assigned to the Japanese Navy. Unless it is carried out, the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet has no confidence that he can fulfill his assigned responsibility. This operation is beset with numerous difficulties, none of which, however, makes it impossible. What concerns us most is the weather, but if there are 7 days in a month where refueling at sea is possible, the chance of success is by no means small. If good fortune is bestowed upon us, we will be assured of success. Should the Hawaii operation by chance end in failure, that would merely imply that fortune is not on our side. That should also be the time for definitely halting all operations. The Chief of the Naval General Staff, Admiral Nagano, understood that Yamamoto's message was very dark, but also realistic, and as a result he said, "If he has that much confidence, it is better to let Yamamoto go ahead." With those words, the Naval General Staff had formally approved the Hawaii operation, and from that moment forward, they would do the best they could to ensure that the plan did not fail. On the 12th of October 1941, Prime Minister Konoe's cabinet was in a meeting, at which the Naval Minister, Admiral Oikawa, was present, and he stated the Navy's point of view. Now we have reached a crossroads where a choice for peace or war should be made. Speaking for the Navy, we will find ourselves at a complete loss, if asked to go to war, until such time as the current negotiations between the United States and Japan reach a deadlock. Following that meeting, the date for December 1st, 1941 was selected for the attack on Pearl Harbor, though at the beginning of November 1941, Admiral Yamamoto attended a briefing with other naval officers and officers from the Army regarding the southern operation, and as a result of this briefing, it was decided that the Pearl Harbor attack would be best delayed until the 8th of December Tokyo time, 7th of December Pearl Harbor time. On the 5th of November 1941, the plan was set forth for Imperial sanction, which it received, resulting in Imperial Naval General Staff Order No. 1. To Commander-in-Chief, Combined Fleet Isoroku Yamamoto, via Chief of Naval General Staff Osami Nagano, by Imperial Order. 1. The Empire has decided to schedule various operational preparations for completion in the early part of December in view of great fears that she will be obliged to go to war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands for her self-existence and self-defense. 2. The Commander-in-Chief, Combined Fleet, will make necessary operational preparations. 3. Detailed instructions will be given by the Chief of the Naval General Staff. From that moment forward, the story of the Pearl Harbor attack is well known. The Japanese ships would assemble, sail across the ocean in two fleets, one being the submarine force and the other being the main carrier strike force, and then the attack would be carried out at 8:30 a.m. on the 7th of December 1941, Pearl Harbor time. So now that we've established the timeline regarding the creators of the Pearl Harbor operation and then looking at some of their own statements, we now have to go back and answer the question that the video set to answer, and that is, was Pearl Harbor successful or not? The answer is yes, as the Japanese intended for the attack to be carried out, it was as successful as they could have imagined. Now, the argument typically put forward against the Pearl Harbor operation being successful is that the Japanese did not get the aircraft carriers, they did not destroy the oil fields, and they did not damage docking and repair facilities for ships, which meant the United States was able to immediately begin recovering and repairing ships that had been damaged or sunk. So let's take a look at those 3 points in respects to the operation as set up by the Japanese. Between the 18th and 20th of November, the submarine force left Japanese waters and proceeded across the Pacific Ocean, where they would then act as a reconnaissance force, giving the Japanese intelligence on the movements of the United States Navy. The final message the submarines would send to the main fleet prior to the attack was received at 20:50 on the 7th of December, Tokyo time. A. Information issued 1800, 7th of December. Utah and a seaplane tender entered harbor the evening of 5th of December. Ships in harbor as of 6th of December. 9 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 3 seaplane tenders, 17 destroyers. In dry docks, 4 light cruisers and 3 destroyers. All carriers and heavy cruisers at sea. No special reports on the fleet. Oahu is quiet and Imperial General Staff is fully convinced of success. The Japanese did not know where the United States carriers were actually located, though they had a few educated guesses, but they also believed that should the United States carriers come back within attack range of the Japanese strike force, then the Japanese submarines would be able to spot them and subsequently destroy them without the Japanese carriers having to get involved. While extraordinary hope had been placed in destroying the United States carriers while also taking out the rest of the battle fleet, it was also recognized that it would be difficult for the U.S. carriers to successfully engage the bulk of the Japanese Navy without adequate support. So what this decision ultimately meant is that Yamamoto was comfortable with going after the United States carriers in the future, as he believed even if he could not sink them during the Pearl Harbor operation, he would be able to do it at a later date, since their support would be poor. It's also worth mentioning that the submarines were incorrect on what types of ships were present in Pearl Harbor at the moment the attack would occur, as in reality there were 8 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, 29 destroyers, 5 submarines, a gunboat, 9 mine layers, 10 minesweepers, 10 seaplane tenders, 3 repair ships, 2 oilers, 2 ocean tugs, a hospital ship, a surveying ship, a supply vessel, an ammunition vessel, a submarine rescue vessel, an antiquated cruiser, and a submarine tender, a total of 94 ships. Out of that number, 19 ships were either sunk or damaged, with 2,403 personnel being killed and 1,178 being wounded. In turn, the Japanese lost 29 aircraft, with a further 74 receiving varying degrees of damage, and they also lost 5 midget submarines, along with one fleet submarine. It's also worth mentioning that the most successful point of the attack that caused the most damage was the attack on the air bases, which resulted in just about 350 aircraft being damaged or destroyed on the United States side. The Japanese had dished out tons of damage while receiving little in return within a single attack. So the question comes to be, why didn't they do a second or a third attack to destroy the oil fields and ship repair facilities? Fukudome actually answered this very question following World War II, and there is a specific paragraph within his response that I think hits the head of the nail perfectly. I think that if Vice Admiral Nagumo had executed 2 or more air attacks, he would undoubtedly have ordered those oil tanks and other military installations on land attacked. But Nagumo had planned from the beginning only one wave of air attacks on Pearl Harbor, and he selected for his targets the direct battle forces rather than the indirect military elements, and decided to concentrate all air attacks on ships and planes. In my opinion, Nagumo made the best choice of targets for the simple attack he launched. To expand upon Fukudome's point, in order for the Japanese to conduct a second or a third attack on Pearl Harbor, they would have to recover the first attack force, separate the damaged aircraft from the undamaged ones, since you're not going to want to use damaged aircraft again for such a long operation. You're going to want the pilots to rest, and you're also going to need to assemble reserve aircraft for the operation to replace the ones that were either lost or damaged. In order for Nagumo's fleet to successfully launch a second full-strength attack, he would have to remain within what is now hostile waters for an additional day, keeping in mind that the Japanese submarines had still not found the U.S. carriers, and this meant a bulk of the Pacific Fleet was in an unknown location to Nagumo. A very strong point that is often overlooked here is that from the very beginning of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Nagumo's carrier force was suffering from poor reconnaissance, which would eventually work against Nagumo at Midway. He was making decisions based on the information he had at hand, which realistically was not enough. His primary goal from the outset, as given by Yamamoto, was to disable the ability for the United States battle line to take place, and this would allow the Japanese Navy and Army to freely expand south for an extended period of time, giving them the ability to build up defenses and prepare themselves for any future attacks, and the ships that were damaged within the Pearl Harbor attack would take months and in some cases years to get back into service. Months is all Yamamoto needed, and years was better than he could have imagined, which ultimately meant from the planning stages of the operation, Nagumo had executed it just as Yamamoto wanted. Of course, the strong argument would be that the attack itself was a blunder, as it would ultimately result in a war that Japan could never win, but that didn't matter to the Japanese, and as far as history is concerned, it also doesn't matter because the attack already happened, and we can't reverse that. I think when we examine the tactics and strategy regarding the Pearl Harbor attack, it's difficult to argue against it being a resounding success. It most definitely was a successful attack as planned, but in the same breath, you can also argue, given hindsight and the conclusion of the war, that the intention of hostilities was to preserve Imperial Japan, and that ultimately failed, but we can't just pin that down to Pearl Harbor, as it is an entire war's worth of battles that resulted in the collapse of the Japanese Empire, not just Pearl Harbor. With that having been said, that is all I wish to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.